Well, a very interesting development in Iraq. There are some reports coming out now that the U.S. might be trying to build some kind of a Sunni state in Iraq. Now, this is something that the U.S. is doing that finally makes sense. For years, there have been so many observers, myself included, although not for that long considering my age. There have been plenty of people who've been wondering, really, since the U.S. got into the war in Iraq, why are they trying to prop up the Shia side when they claim that their big enemy in the Middle East is Iran? Why, of all the factions in Iraq, would they try and prop up the most, anti-American and most pro-Iran of those factions? And, really there hasn't been much pushback against this whole idea of, having one man, one vote in a centralized democratic government, which, inevitably would be Shia dominated since they are the supermajority of the population there. They would elect a majority of the members of parliament when we're talking about holding national elections. And, well, there was actually one proposal back in 2007 by Joe Biden to break Iraq into three countries, to split it up by sect so that you had a Kurdish country, a Sunni country, and a Shiite country. But unfortunately, this proposal already came after the democratization of Iraq. The time for this kind of a proposal would have been after the U.S. won the war and was trying to set up the new Iraq. Frankly, I don't think that the Iraq War was a good idea and that it was, ever going to be worth the cost to the U.S. But if they were going to go ahead and do it, you should do it to try and make the situation there a little more beneficial for you. And the obvious thing then would have been splitting off the Shiite portions of Iraq and, just sort of writing that off and saying, okay, that's going to be Iran's sphere of influence. That's fine. We're going to deal with that. But then we'll save all of the, the Sunni Arab and the Kurdish, which are also Sunni for the most parts, for ourselves. And we will carve out our spheres of influence there because, geographically, the Sunni Arabs and the Kurds make up the biggest swath of the country, I believe. Geographically, the Shia Arabs are in a relatively small area, I think. I mean, don't get me wrong; it's still about a third of the country, but it is, it's not the whole thing. So you didn't have to give them all of Iraq, which is what the U.S. essentially did in, I guess it was 2005. The first elections were held, and the reason why they did that was that the Shiites were putting pressure on them, essentially, threatening an insurgency if there was not one man, one vote. But you could still have one man, one vote if you split Iraq into three countries. And of course, that's, we're way past that part now. Iraq is not going to be officially split into three independent countries, but there are provisions in the Constitution for really any province, I think, the way it's written, to gain autonomy from Baghdad so that they are no longer under the thumb of the central government. This is what the Kurds did. The Kurds right now, I believe, are the only autonomous region, and so now there are rumblings from MPs in Anbar that Anbar province, which is, some of you might remember is kind of, I guess, where the worst fighting of the Iraq War was. That's where Fallujah is. It's a big open desert. There's not really much there, but there's a lot of Sunni Arabs who don't like living under Shiite domination. A lot of people who generally would be predisposed towards not liking Iran. And so because of this, the U.S. seems to be somewhat looking favorably upon them and their quest for semi-autonomy within Iraq to gain a bit of independence from Baghdad, because to the extent that these, Sunni Arabs are able to assert their own will, they will be, or rather, to the extent that they're not being dominated by a Iranian-dominated Shiite government in Baghdad, well, then that leaves them more open to being dominated by the U.S. And so this would create a window of opportunity for the U.S. to assert greater influence within Iraq, because it looks like they're finally giving up on trying to influence the Shia government there. Because since, I guess, 2005, the U.S. has been trying to sort of buy the loyalty of the Shiite government in Baghdad, and hoping that if they just gave them enough weapons and money and training, that eventually they would consider the U.S. to be their friend. that still doesn't really seem to be the case. I mean, they might be okay with the U.S., but fundamentally they're going to remain loyal to their next-door neighbors, Iran. They don't really want to piss them off. And frankly, as I've said so many times, a lot of the parties in Iraq have their origins in Iran. A lot of them lived in exile in Iran, so they're not going to abandon that ally in favor of the U.S. And so again, I don't think it's a good idea for the U.S. to be trying to assert its influence in Iraq, but if you're going to do it, this is the way to go about it. You're going to want to split off Anbar and Kurdistan, and maybe next Nineveh. I'm hearing rumblings that there are some MPs in Nineveh who want to pursue the same thing, and it might be a mass exodus once. If you can shave off Anbar, which is the biggest province of Iraq geographically, well then that really leaves the door open for all the other provinces. I don't know how many there are. There's quite a few, and most of them are pretty small. But once Anbar is shaved off, and then Nineveh is shaved off, and then you take into account the Kurdistan region, which I believe makes up multiple provinces, well then that's a pretty big chunk of Iraq that will be under American influence, because of course all of the Sunni states are under American influence. All the Sunni states pretty much get along well, I guess except for Qatar, because Qatar is trying to sort of play both sides. And then you have Turkey with their Muslim Brotherhood type stuff, so I guess you could worry about that. But I mean, I don't think the U.S. is quite as worried about Turkish influence as they are Iranian influence. Now, from a broader philosophical point of view, do I think this is a good idea? The answer is yes, because just as from a political theory standpoint, it's better to have smaller polities to where each individual voter has more of a control and more say over what actually happens, regarding how their government is run, than it is to have some big lumbering central government that dominates a wide swath of people, particularly when you have this majoritarian political structure to where the supermajority of a country, or just frankly a simple majority, can dominate over the minority. It's not very fun to live in that kind of a place if you are one of the minorities, such as the Sunni Arabs in Anbar. And of course, there are other, minorities in Iraq too. It's just that the Sunni Arabs and the Kurds are the two big ones. There's also you've got Christians of various different denominations. You have Turks. And even within the Christians, I believe you have some that identify as Arabs, some that are Kurds, and some that are Assyrian. And there might be other groups there. And then, of course, you had that whole Yazidi thing. You remember that seemed to be kind of a propaganda stunt, I guess. The Yazidis on Mount Sinjar, they're going to die unless we invade right now, and there's going to be all the Yazidis wiped out. I never really looked into that too much, but it felt very fishy. It reminded me of Kuwait. But anyway, in order to make sure that none of these groups really are being oppressed by the other, really what the best thing to do is to devolve all power pretty much down to the smallest polity possible. I don't know what they call a county in Iraq, but basically that equivalent, or what Thomas Jefferson called ward republics. Something similar, I guess you could think, to a map of medieval Europe, to where you have all these little tiny polities, of course run by some local noblemen, but even that is better than having mass democracy, because you have much more influence over, a nobleman in your town than you would over, say, your congressman. And even if you did manage to get your own congressman to do what you want, well, then you have to worry about, the 435 other congressmen. So yeah, the Sunni Arabs in Anbar are in a position to where they want to have their own security forces, they want to have their own laws, they want to have their own elected government, they want a government that actually represents their interests, not the interests of the people in the east of the country. And so even though their success and their road to independence might persist, the U.S. presence in Iraq, which is something I greatly would like to end, I still do not wish them any ill. It's not their fault that the U.S. also would benefit from their trying to escape the dominion of Baghdad. I'm not one of these people who thinks that, you're a bad person if you ally with some foreign government to try and rebel against your own government. I think that people ultimately should do, an ally with whoever they need to further their own interests. I think that you really have to be a brainwashed lemming to think that it's better to live under the domination of your fellow countrymen, so-called, rather than the domination of foreigners, even if the foreigners are offering you a better deal. Oh, and one last thing before I wrap this up: the geopolitical consequences of this. I guess the U.S. has a great interest in trying to make sure this happens, because they want to deny Iran a so-called land bridge, also known as a road, one of my favorite Scott Horton lines. It's so funny how these folks in Washington come up with these, rather strange words to describe very simple concepts. But yes, they're trying to stop Iran from paving a road from their country all the way to the Mediterranean. And of course, since they have, friends in Syria and Lebanon, they could easily pave the road through those countries. But if the folks in Anbar gain autonomy, well, then they're not going to have a route through Iraq into Syria, and so the land bridge, so-called, could never be completed. And that's something that the U.S. has been very focused on for many years. So is Israel, of course. Israel doesn't want Iran to be able to, ship goods back and forth between the Mediterranean and their country. I guess they want everything to go by boat. And so, this might be a last gasp by the U.S., or it might be just the next phase of the war. Who knows? But if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.